Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my dear and wonderful sensitive ones. Welcome to episode 181, where we are going to talk about the HSP timeout, which I believe firmly is a tool that no HSP should live or love without. First off, though, I want to acknowledge that if you're in the US in particular, but also other places in the world, and you're paying any attention to what's going on, you're probably feeling a lot of sadness and fear and anger, and you may feel very stressed and worried and really feel deeply for those who are getting the brunt of this brutal treatment from our so-called leaders. So if you're a sensitive person, I know you're feeling some of this to some degree if you're paying attention. And so since this episode is about timeouts, I want to give you permission, not that you need it from me, but sometimes it helps to hear it. I want to give you permission to take a time out from the news, from social media, and from doing anything at all about it. I mean, absolutely, yes, please do what you can. And make sure you also take time to nourish and caretake yourself. Do things that bring you joy, rest, be creative, do what you know to do to nourish yourself and feed yourself emotionally and spiritually. That is so important. That is so necessary. Our world needs you to be well because you care, because you are part of the remedy, the medicine that our world needs right now. So yes, act on behalf of others who are having their power taken from them and on behalf of the country that you want and the world that you want, but also make sure you take time out from that to tend to you and your big, tender, and glorious mind, body, heart system. I'm right here beside you, rooting you on. And if you want to make sure that I am consistently there for you, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast and you're on my email list. If you're not on it already, absolutely get on it. I show up there a little bit more frequently than the podcast. I want to be there for you. So you can head to my website and hop on my email list there, or I'll put the link in the show notes. You can just jump right on it if you look in the description of this podcast. All right, let's talk about the HSP timeout and why it's so important. So as HSPs, we can get emotionally overwhelmed or flooded, as some people call it, more quickly than others, or it seems that way anyway. And one of the prime culprits is loaded conversations or conflict with our partner or our kids or our relatives or our coworkers, right? So I work with my clients in depth to help them feel safer and much more at ease during those times. But until they're super good at staying grounded in situations that used to trigger intense emotions and overload, I teach them a key thing to do so that they can get back to navigating that conflict or that charge moment with grace and sensitivity and effectiveness, and in a way they feel really good about. And of course, this thing that I teach is something I've used myself plenty of times, and it's been the difference between staying super locked into conflict and sort of that downward spiraling interactions that can happen with our husbands, right? And also my kids, for example, and being able to come to peace and understanding and resolution and positive solutions for the future. So it's been enormously helpful for me and for my clients. So today I want to introduce it to you because if you're a sensitive woman who wants to show up at your best and have the best relationship you can with your significant other, this is one tool you must have in your toolbox and actually use, right? Don't just let it sit there in your toolbox just sitting there, right? No, you need to use it if you want to benefit from it. And benefit from it you will when you use it. Because this can truly make or break a relationship. It's that powerful. And it's going to serve you in any situation that tends to spike your stress levels to a point that causes you to feel overwhelmed or like it's just too much. Like I said in the beginning of this podcast, during wild kind of world and cultural and national times like the one we're in right now. And of course, that tool that I'm talking about is what I call the HSP time out. So in this episode, I'm going to break down how to do this HSP timeout, and I'm going to break it down into 4 distinct simple steps. But first, let me share some background on it, like why to do it, and of course, when to do it. So the HSP timeout is absolutely one of my most relied upon tools, at least in the initial phases of learning to work with our sensitivity and handling conflict and overstimulation in our marriages, and actually just in our lives in general as HSPs. So really, I'd like you to understand that taking a time out, which we could also call setting a boundary for yourself, is actually a way to take care of yourself and your marriage. Okay? That's really important to understand. This is a way to take care of yourself and your marriage and your partner. Because when conflict is happening and you're feeling emotionally flooded or reactive or triggered, whatever you want to call it, when emotions are running really strong, you are likely to do damage and not resolve things well, not find common ground, and in fact, make things worse between you. Obviously, this is also true for your partner if they're the one who's obviously really triggered or angry. So the timeout is good then as well, but we actually would call that not a timeout. We'd call that setting a relationship boundary. And I talked in depth about boundaries, relationship boundaries in episode 51. So check that one out. That one goes really hand in hand with what we're talking about here. And to say a few more words on that, both the time out and a relationship boundary are for the benefit of yourself and the relationship. So a relationship boundary is what you're going to do when another person, like your spouse, crosses a line that you've set to take care of yourself. So like if they're so triggered that they're name calling, right? They're calling you a name or names, or they're yelling, you set a relationship boundary. So that's when your spouse or another person is acting out emotionally, right? But taking a time out, on the other hand, is what you do for yourself and the relationship when you are super triggered or upset. Yeah? So one's for when your partner's upset or triggered, and one's for when you are upset or triggered. So really, all the HSP timeout is removing yourself from the situation when you reach a certain stimulation threshold, when you feel too overwhelmed, when you feel too stressed, when you feel too upset, when you feel too emotionally flooded or triggered. Yeah. So again, I want to reiterate that this is beautiful in the midst of conflict, in the height of a conflict, and it should be used then. And please hear me on this. When you take a time out in a situation like that, it does not mean that you're abandoning your spouse or you're not handling the issue. In fact, it usually means you're setting yourself up and your spouse up to handle it so much better. The HSP timeout is also great in general if, like, for example, my kids do chores after dinner, which is amazing, but they always love putting on their loud music to do their chores. And usually my husband's kind of chatty after dinner, and my younger son gets kind of wild and is jumping around. So in other words, there's a lot of what feels like chaos to my system post-dinner at my house. Especially in the past, it was really too much for my system. And even the other night, I took a time out. So I used to take regular timeouts at this time just because I was feeling overwhelmed by it all, like just too much stimulation, right? I'm sure most of you totally get what I'm saying. So that was a really beautiful way to support myself, to help myself decompress. And then after, I was able to be back to my calm, centered self and return to my family in that space and show up in a way I love to be able to show up for and with them, right? So we can actually connect and have a good time as a family post dinner. oftentimes it used to be without taking that, it just was rough after dinner, right? So I'll tell you in a minute or a little later why I'm saying it used to be important. You'll hear more on that in a bit. So that's really the huge main benefit of the timeout. It gives you the time your body, mind, and heart system, your mind, body, heart system need, right? Biochemically and nervous system wise, to resettle, to come back to a truly centered, calm place where you actually have your wits about you, where you have access again to your higher intelligence centers and to your heart and to your values, so you can communicate and work through things from there, which will always give you a way better result than trying to push through when you're overstimulated or triggered. So that's why to do it and when to take a timeout. So I'm going to tell you the 4 steps of how to do it now. So the first step of the HSP timeout, and honestly, you don't have to be an HSP to do this. You could just call it the timeout, right? The first step is simply an awareness or an understanding step, and we've actually already gone through it. It's really just to know that taking this kind of timeout is a benefit to you and your relationship. This is why I spent some time explaining why it's such a benefit. It's absolutely, when you take it, going to allow you to get back to the part of yourself, your heart, your higher brain, that will allow you to show up best in the relationship so that you can address anything that needs to be addressed from that space of like your clear-headed, big-hearted self, right? The best of you. Yeah? So as a first step, you may need to remind yourself of that when you find yourself overly activated. Yeah? So just get clear. This HSP timeout is a benefit. And you might need to say that to yourself when you remember, when you notice you're like in a conflict and overstimulated, remind yourself of that. The second step is to know your own personal threshold for when you need to take a timeout. So my favorite way of teaching this is with what I call the emotional scale. I like to think of the emotional scale as kind of like a rating chart from a -10 to a +10 scale, with 0 being in the center. So for our purposes today, for the HSP timeout, we actually really only need to pay attention to the sort of quote unquote negative part of the scale, the -10 to 0 part. So when you're at 0, just so you understand this, 0 is where you feel neutral. Like there's no emotion really. It's not necessarily that you're numb. You're just not bad. You're not good. You're not happy. You're not sad. You're just neutral. And -10 is the most overstimulated, the most angry, the most upset, the most emotional turmoil you've felt. Yeah? So I'm going to say that if you ever reach an emotional state of a -4 or a -5, that's an indication that you've probably reached your threshold for when you have the capacity to be clear-headed and clear-hearted, right? Which means that's when it's time to take a timeout at a -4 or -5 on that scale. Now, of course, everyone's unique. So maybe for you, it's not until you reach a -6 in emotional intensity that you need to take a timeout. So just decide for yourself and then stick to it. Now, of course, deciding for yourself might mean taking a little while, just noticing, like, what is it like when you're at a -4? What is it like when you're at a -6? And do you still have your wits about you? Are you still able to, like, calmly communicate, or are you kind of losing it a little bit there? Like, for me, I would definitely wouldn't go past a -5 to take a timeout. Now, one more hint on this is the way that you'll actually know that you've reached a 4 or a 5 or a 6. It's really by understanding how you sense emotions. And you may not have heard this before. Of course, if you've been listening to the podcast, you will have heard this before, but it's really important to understand this. We recognize we are feeling emotion by sensing how our sensations feel in our body, by sensing our body, in other words. That is the measure of emotion. That is how emotion is experienced in our body. If you pay attention, you will start to see this. I know it can feel like we sense emotion in our heads and our thoughts. And yes, there is something to that, like how fast our thoughts are going, how intense and negative our thoughts are. But really, when we slow down, we pay attention to our body, that's where we're going to notice our emotions most acutely. So in my next episode, I'm actually going to teach you a very excellent tool for getting great at being aware of where you are on the emotional scale. And there's other benefits to what I'm going to teach you next time. Because honestly, we are not taught to be in our body in our Western culture. So although around here in this HSP deep feeling community, we do feel deeply, but many of us still don't recognize it early on before we react out of it and cause more challenges and issues in our relationship, because we are not in our bodies as much as we could be and ultimately need to be emotionally super intelligent, emotionally regulated, emotionally full of agency. But for now, and until next episode, I want to invite you to, during moments of conflict or upset in your relationship, you can simply start noticing, where am I on the emotional scale? How stimulated am I? How overwhelmed am I? How upset am I? How strong are these sensations in my body? Would I rate that at a -1? Would I rate that at a -4? Would I rate that at a -8? All right, so just start paying attention. You'll really know by the sensations in your body if you really pay attention. So, of course, this is a skill to develop, so be patient with yourself as you develop it, and absolutely listen to the next episode to help a bunch more with this. Okay, so that is step 2. Know your threshold. And you'll know it by paying attention, and eventually you're going to know, is it a -4? Yep, it's a -4 for me. Or nope, it's a -6 for me. That's my threshold. So once you have that threshold, it's time for step 3, which is to take the actual time out. Leave the room, in other words. So most of the time you're going to be in a room when this is happening, right? When you reach that state of a -3, a -4, -6, whatever it is for you. It'll be a little different if you're riding in the car, as some of my clients have reported they've wanted to either set a boundary or take a time out. Obviously, you can't just jump out of the car when that's happening. So what you might do instead is to just zip your mouth, turn towards the door, or whatever it is that you can do in that moment to just give yourself some space. You might simply say, hey, honey, things are getting a little heated. Can we take a break? I just need a few moments to calm myself down so that I can be in a better space to interact with you better, right? And that's a side note here. I do recommend that you communicate that to your partner anytime, right? As part of when you're actually going to take that time out, I highly recommend communicating it to them. Now, you can communicate it in a separate conversation ahead of time, like when there is no conflict. You can be like, hey, I'm going to try this new thing because I want to show up as the best partner I can be with you. So when I reach this certain level of emotional stimulation, I'm going to take myself to the other room so that I can calm down and come back to you in a better place. And you may also remind them of that when you actually leave, or you don't have to. You can just be like, okay, I need a moment, and you can just go. I do recommend saying a little something instead of just walking away, because it can be perceived as like you're giving them the cold shoulder, you're abandoning them. So highly recommended to communicate ahead of time, and then actually every time you go ahead and take that time out, just say a little something about, oh, okay, now I'm going to go do this so that we can address this better and I can show up better in a little while. Okay, so that was a little but important side note. But step 3 is really about actually taking leave. And that really can be the hardest piece of this. So if you have an issue with actually removing yourself for a little while, that's not weird. That's very common. And oftentimes, if you're kind of more, you tend towards people pleasing, or you have that pretty normal urgency to fix it now, right? Like so many of us do. It can be hard to just take yourself out of the room, right? I think we so often just want to resolve things, and we think if we just push through, we'll get there quicker. But that's so rarely the truth if we're overstimulated, if we're already triggered. So perhaps I'll talk more about this urgency thing or people pleasing, although I know I have talked about these things before on the podcast. But this is where believing in the benefits of the timeout has to be stronger than your commitment to old habits like that urgency to fix it now or people pleasing. Yeah. So this is why the first step that I shared is absolutely the first step, which is knowing why and remembering that the HSP timeout benefits your relationship. In any case, when it's time to set the timeout, leave the room lovingly. Lovingly take your own hand and say to yourself, this is the best thing for all of us at the moment. And also articulate that in your own way to your partner. Honestly, some people find that their partners don't love this, but again, if you articulate it well in advance, like, hey, next time this happens, this is what I'm going to do, like I said a few minutes ago, most partners will take it better. And especially if you make it about you and not about them, and like you wanting to show up best and you wanting to make sure you can resolve things and work through things the best. Which brings me to the fourth step. Once you've managed to leave the space and go be by yourself, it's time to do whatever you need to do to intentionally decompress, to self-soothe, to emotionally regulate. Now, there's of course so much that we can do here. And I have a whole process that I teach my clients, and I work with them individually when I'm working with them individually to really find what best works for them on an individual level. But they do work in depth on this and become really masters at self-soothing so they can get back to their clear-headed, warm-hearted, open, loving selves who have great capacity for problem solving and resolving issues and all of that. Now, I'm not currently, at this date, this is February, taking one-on-one or group coaching clients at the moment, but the Stop Taking It So Personally course teaches many great pieces of this, and you can get access to it today. So I'm going to put links in the show notes to that course, or you can find it over at my website, hspmarriagecoaching.com, under the courses tab. So that's an awesome place to build some of these skills that you'll actually turn towards when you take a time out. You can also hop on the waitlist for my Foundations of Emotional Wellbeing for HSPs. This is where you'll develop deep emotional regulation skills as an HSP. So the timeout will be super effective for you because you'll know just what to do to get back to that calm, centered place inside of yourself quickly. So you'll find the description of Foundations of Emotional Wellbeing and the access to get on the waitlist over in the show notes, and also under that same courses tab at my website. So either of these courses are great places to learn the skills of getting back to that peaceful place inside of yourself during these timeouts and also just in general. And they work amazingly hand in hand, these two courses together. So they're really complementary. So consider doing both of them, but start with one. But a few things to know about what it takes during this timeout to actually come to that calm, regulated place again. Usually it takes at least 20 minutes for most of the biochemistry to cool down, or up to 24 hours to be totally back to center, unless you use the tools that I teach in these courses. And then it can be a lot faster. So do expect it to take some time if you don't have the skills and the knowledge to deeply self-regulate. Another tip for this is when you've left the room and you're decompressing, you don't want to be thinking about all the bad things that happened and kind of doing this me against him thing that our brains tend to do when we've gotten into conflict with our partner. Or especially if this has been a conflict that you're leaving from, you want to do your best to not be in your head about it, but to come back home to the body, right? If you're in your head, you're just going to be feeding the stress and the overwhelm. If you come back to your body, this is how you begin to settle and regulate. So this could be a great time for deep breathing or dancing or doing some exercise thing that like shakes off all that extra emotion, like going for a walk or a jog or whatever. Anything that you know that will reliably bring you back to a more calm, centered space. And I hope you have several of those things. And if not, absolutely come join Foundations of Emotional Wellbeing and or Stop Taking It So Personally. So those are the 4 steps. I'm going to reiterate them succinctly right now. Step 1 for the HSP timeout is remember the timeout is a big benefit to you and your relationship. Number 2, know your personal emotional threshold. Next episode will help more with that. Number 3, leave the room, i.e. take that time out. Number 4, intentionally decompress and self-soothe while you are in the timeout. So that is it in a big nutshell. And then after you've taken the time out, when you feel calm again and centered emotionally, then you can return to the conversation or ask your spouse if they're ready to address things again. Obviously, if they're not ready, tell them to tell you when they're ready, or you might plan to address it more deeply when there's actually a good time for that, maybe in 24 hours, maybe in 48 hours. You guys can decide when to address it again. Or it may be something that doesn't actually even need to be addressed, and that's fine too, as long as it's not like a recurring issue, or I don't want you to just brush it under the rug, in other words, unless it really is something sort of silly that you got hooked into. Then you can just let it go. But of course, you're going to have much more luck with resolving things and communicating when you have both had some time and you're both settled again. And if you missed the last episode about the 9 ground rules for smoother conflict, they're going to be way easier to implement from this calm place. So if you missed that episode, definitely go have a listen, because that's really helpful to make conflict into more of an actual conversation that gets you somewhere instead of, hurts and tears you down. So I do want to share that what's so fun about the time out is that you might not have to take them for the duration of your life. Yeah? What I've found is I used to use this tool all the time, and now I use it rarely. And this is because I've gotten to the point where my capacity for stress and overwhelm and sort of the place where I get triggered is much further away. My capacity for upset is larger, meaning I'm not as overstimulated or as upset as I easily used to get. I'm much more emotionally regulated, and I know how to stay there much better. I can handle more noise, I can handle more emotion, I can handle more stimulation. So things just don't bother me as much. And part of that is I make regular time for myself to keep my nervous system well and healthy and resilient when I'm not upset. Like, I make that a normal part of my week. But it's also because I've had a lot of practice at this, and I've learned to expand my capacity for overstimulation and stress and conflict so that I can stay calm without having to leave and take time outs as often. And you're going to be able to get there too as you learn more emotional agency and regulation. And again, the best ways to get there are the Stop Taking It So Personally course and Foundations of Emotional Well-Being course, and of course, Coaching and Treasured when I open it again. But I definitely recommend starting with Stop Taking It So Personally or the Foundations of Emotional Well-Being for now. Again, the links to learn more about those courses are in the show notes and at my website. All right, lastly, I just want to say this time out thing works. So use it, implement it. It will help so much. This is really a tool no HSP should live or love without. All right, my friends, be oh so well.